fun.
Yeah.
Our scouts report they're massing. And what of the northern pass?
We have men there, but their numbers are few.
Hey guys, welcome back to tonight's exploration of the Tudor dynasty's darkest corners. Before we begin, take a moment to create your own space. Lower the lights, wrap yourself in a warm blanket, and let your spirit settle, ready for even the faintest sound to resonate through the night. In the next few minutes, we will reveal the horrifying truth about the children of Henry VIII, the story of how the most powerful king in Europe turned his own offspring into political pawns using isolation, coercion, and bloody gaslighting disguised as paternal love. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Leave a comment below so we can connect across space and time and step together into the secrets reserved for hearts bold enough to face the darkness. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Try closing your eyes and let yourself sink into this image. You are a child, perhaps only 6, perhaps already 16, and your father is the most powerful figure in all of Europe. He commands vast armies, decrees life or death for anyone, and proclaims himself the very mouthpiece of God on earth. Yet the histories you have read so seldom mention his dark side. He is the one who shatters the hearts of the very children he claims to love. In the year 1533, a baby girl was born beneath the glittering lights of the Tudor court. They said she would one day become a legendary queen, but first she had to endure a nightmare more brutal than any battlefield. She was the daughter of Henry VIII. This was far more than the neglect or harshness typical of medieval parenting. It was a deliberate campaign of psychological torture, a meticulously crafted strategy to turn his own blood into pawns on the chessboard of power. Feel the confusion that gripped Mary at just 11 years old. One day she was celebrated as Princess Tudor, the future of the realm. The next day her title was stripped. She was branded a bastard, left to live in isolation without comforts or her mother's protection. Every beautiful gown, every precious jewel, even the books she treasured were confiscated and handed over to her half-sister. The ultimate humiliation came when Henry forced her to kneel before an infant and change her sister's diaper, an act of degradation disguised as royal duty. Yet the cruelest methods were not lashings or loud admonitions. Henry systematically destroyed his daughter's faith in her own memories. He monitored every letter, blocked every familiar visit, and engaged in gaslighting, causing her to doubt her recollections of her mother and the love they once shared. He wielded Mary's faith as a weapon, demanding she acknowledge him as head of the church or risk eternal damnation. When Henry finally died, the legacy he left was not a stable throne but broken souls. One daughter hardened by endurance, another transformed into a survival genius, and his sole son twisted into a weapon against his own sisters. Every ruthless act, every threat, was part of a calculated plan by a king desperate for a male heir. Tonight, we will do more than recount these events. We will expose the intricate machinery of psychological torture behind them. This is a profound reminder to anyone facing emotional pain. You are not alone, and even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can find light. The journey ahead will peel away the shine of history, to reveal hidden truths, guiding you through doors few dare to open. And to begin, let us listen to the story of Mary Tudor, the young girl stripped of her identity, yet who kept the flame of hope alive in her heart. Imagine this. You are only 11 years old. Yesterday, you were affectionately called Princess Tudor by your parents, the bright future of the kingdom. Today, you are labelled a bastard, stripped of your title overnight. Yesterday, you were the heir to the English throne. Today, legally, you are nobody. Yesterday, when you entered a room, your father smiled at you. Today, he won't even mention your name. This is the cruel reality young Mary Tudor faced, beginning in 1533, and it was only the start of a nightmare that would span decades. As a child, Mary was celebrated for her intelligence and grace within the court. She spoke Latin fluently, played the virginal with exquisite skill, and her dance steps carried the poised elegance of a future queen. Foreign envoys, upon leaving their missions, would write home that they had never seen a child under 10 discuss theology and politics with such maturity. But that admiration vanished the moment Henry VIII saw Mary as the greatest obstacle to his desires. Henry's love for Mary always came with one condition: do not stand between me and what I want. When he resolved to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to wed Anne Boleyn, Mary suddenly became both an emotional and political threat. If that first marriage were valid, Mary was legitimate, and every step Henry took to break from the Roman Church would be undermined. His entire religious revolution would collapse like a sandcastle. So Henry acted as he always did with those who challenged him. He destroyed them. But destroying Mary required a particular cruelty, a calculated method of psychological torment that seeped into her spirit like poison into her veins. It began subtly. First, she was separated from her mother, losing warm shared meals and private conversations in her mother tongue. Then her title was taken, her attendants dismissed, and her tutors replaced or sent away. Every beautiful gown, every precious jewel, even her cherished books were seized and given to her infant half-sister. Yet the ultimate humiliation came when Henry forced Mary to kneel before the newborn and change her sister's diaper. The image of a Tudor princess, grand before the world, became the most degrading spectacle, a traumatic snapshot etched forever in the mind of an 11-year-old. Each decree, each cold glance from the courtiers, and that chilling half-smile from her father, inflicted wounds that would not easily heal. First, Mary was separated from her mother. Gone were the daily visits through the cold, stone corridors of the court. Gone were the warm shared meals by flickering candlelight. Gone were the whispered conversations in Spanish about martyrs and sacred prayers. Catherine was sent into exile to lonely castles on remote islands, where the sea wind howled through narrow windows, and Mary was forbidden to see her. Imagine being only 11 years old, sitting alone by the red velvet drapes of your chamber window, your gaze lost in the distant ocean, yet the one person who made you feel safe was no longer there. Mary's faith in the world shattered overnight. Each evening she heard the waves crashing like whispers from a stranger's palace. She tried to paint in her mind her mother's comforting smile, but the memory slowly faded. That first loss planted a seed of unhealable solitude in her heart. It did not end there. Mary was stripped of her title. Princess Mary was no longer the proud voice at royal ceremonies. In a single night, she went from being England's most cherished child to a legal nobody. Her loyal attendants, the ones who soothed her when she cried in fear, were dismissed without farewell. Her tutor, the man who had stood by her through countless Latin lessons beside the Thames, was expelled under the astonished gaze of the courtiers. All her finely embroidered gowns, precious jewels, and beloved history books were gathered and handed over to her newborn half-sister Elizabeth. The palace fractured into shards of memories, like a broken mirror that could never be reassembled. Then the cruelty deepened. Henry compelled Mary to serve her own half-sister. The former Princess of England was now forced to bow before an infant, bending low under the dim glow of oil lamps to help change the baby's diaper. That image etched itself into Mary's soul like an indelible wound. But the mental torment did not end there. Henry's next command was even more harrowing. Mary was to sign a document declaring her mother's marriage invalid and herself a bastard. He demanded she erase her entire identity with her own hand. Mary refused. In the faint light of that long night, her hand trembled as she held the pen, watching her father's shadow flicker on the high window. Her refusal was not merely a stand for her rights, but a public defiance of the court's absolute power. Henry's face, cold as stone, revealed how far he was willing to go to destroy his own flesh and blood. In that moment, Mary fought not just for her mother, for the truth, but for the essence of herself. She understood that signing that document would not only strip her of her title, but erase her very identity. And that, she realized, was the most excruciating torture of all, being forced to lose yourself in front of the father you once trusted. The ultimate torture had not ended there. The king dispatched his most brutal executioners to Mary's residence to instill pure terror. Thomas Cromwell, the architect behind the executions of Thomas More and John Fisher, arrived under darkness with a single icy command: sign the document or face the same fate as those who defied the king. Imagine Mary at 17, isolated in the empty great hall, surrounded by blood-stained men carrying out a tyrant's will. Their iron-shod footsteps rang across the marble floor like whispers of death. In the weeks that followed, Mary was completely cut off. Every door in the castle remained firmly shut, dampness seeping through the oak wood, creating an oppressive gloom. No friends, no familiar faces came near. Instead, she heard the restless pacing of guards, the soft stamp of official seals, and the laboured breathing of those waiting to see if she would surrender. Each night, Mary tossed and turned on her velvet-covered bed, sumptuous yet chilling, replaying the lies forced upon her. Your parents were never wed. Your entire childhood is a fabrication. Worse than death threats was the slow erasure of her sweetest memories, of all the promises her parents had whispered by firelight. That deep-seated dread stemmed not only from the threat of death, but from the destruction of her very identity. Mary remembered the glowing candles in her mother's embroidery room, and the laughter echoing as they recounted the lives of saints by the hearth, then realized how quickly it had all vanished. She had to choose. Embrace the falsehoods to stay alive, or hold on to the truth and risk everything. For many months, Mary persisted. She breathed slowly, clutched her thin silk blanket, reminding herself that no matter how hard the regime tried to erase her past, she would not yield. Each morning, as dawn's light filtered through the window, she stood with red-rimmed eyes but unwavering resolve. She weathered every threat, every contemptuous glance, and the court's most sophisticated gaslighting. Courtiers insisted on rewriting her reality, demanded she sign away her identity, and yet she remained unbroken. Yet human strength has limits. Her frail body flagged from nights of sleepless tension, and there came a time when Mary thought she could stand no more. In that moment of utter exhaustion, she found herself asking the question that all victims of torment must face. What will finally break my spirit? The physical fatigue or the relentless doubt about my own memories? This question pressed heavily on her heart, yet served as an internal wake-up call. If she surrendered, all would be lost. In her darkest hour, Mary discovered a new reservoir of resilience. She remembered her mother's unconditional love, the unwavering support that had nurtured her soul. She whispered to herself, "As long as I hold on to the truth within my heart, even in the loneliest night, I am still me." With that determination, Mary finally signed the document, but only after clearly marking a defiant footnote, not out of fear, but to protect the most precious fragments of her memories, to keep alive a flicker of hope in the consuming darkness. When Catherine of Aragon died in early 1536, the blood seemed to drain from Mary's veins. She had nothing left to fight for. In a small stone chamber, the ancient oak desk bore only a single document covered in wax seals. A quill hovered above an inkwell. Mary trembled as she signed her name, declaring herself a bastard. With a solemn nod, she acknowledged her father as the supreme head of the church, and her mother's marriage as invalid. In that moment, it felt as though a final blow shattered every remaining fragment of her heart. But Henry would not be satisfied with mere words. He demanded that Mary's broken spirit be exposed for all to see. Mary was summoned back to the palace not as a daughter, but as a warning. She had to walk through the grand hall, where nobles in resplendent attire gathered, forcing a strained smile under watchful eyes. That smile, upon her thin lips, contained no joy, only the sorrowful performance she was compelled to enact. Mary watched as Henry paraded through the gates in a magnificent procession, conversing casually with Anne Boleyn, the woman who had stood behind secret doors, silently controlling her fate. The sound of horses' hooves echoed in the crisp air. Banners fluttered in the wind, forming a majestic yet chilling tableau. Mary stood hidden behind a marble column, tears brimming as she saw the man who robbed her of her childhood holding Anne's hand, the very woman she had once viewed as a hidden adversary. Only months later, Anne Boleyn faced the same blade she never wished to see. Anne's execution was the final blow in the tragic saga, overshadowing Mary. All the attempts to force her renounce her status, all the rituals of degradation, every tear she shed in solitude had been rendered meaningless. Henry swiftly moved on to his third wife, a fresh hope for the king. Yet for Mary, that hope lay in ashes. The most terrifying aspect of this entire ordeal was that Henry never restored Mary's dignity. Though he occasionally invited her back to court, even placing her formally in the line of succession, genuine compassion was never granted. Mary walked on fragile eggshells, each step sounding an alarm. She never knew when a tender glance might turn to cold indifference, or when another fit of brutal rage would erupt. The palace, once dazzling with pink candles and golden draperies, became haunted by the phantoms of her memories. Day after day, Mary lived in suspicion, never daring to smile wholeheartedly, never trusting kind words. Every glance from a courtier, every small congratulation, made her flinch. By the end of Henry's reign, Mary remained like an orphaned bird amid a storm, surrounded by regal splendor, yet burdened by a soul wounded beyond repair. Mary lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, day and night. Each morning, as dawn's light filtered through the towering windows, she never knew whether the day would herald her expulsion from the palace, grant a fleeting reunion with her mother, or bring a small token from her father meant to keep her silent. The echo of footsteps on the marble corridors past reliefs, depicting mighty conquests, became warnings. Mary learned to pass every whisper from servants, every glance from courtiers, and each gesture from the king himself. Whenever those heavy oak doors creaked open, her heart clenched. The psychological wounds of her childhood shaped Mary's entire being thereafter. Her fervent Catholic faith became not merely creed, but a final bulwark against annihilation of spirit. She wielded that faith to withstand countless assaults, yet it would later serve as the rationale for her own brutal suppression of Protestants, an unconscious vendetta born of her long years of terror. Every step Mary took bore the weight of loss. Standing on a balcony, overlooking the royal gardens, once ablaze with Tudor roses, she still sensed a melancholic fragrance. The dim torchlight, flickering along slick stone pathways in the evening mist, cast shadows that deepened the palace's mystery. Figures flitted through corridors, faces skilled in intrigue, ensuring Mary never found peace. But Mary was not the king's sole victim. While she endured her gilded prison, another young girl was learning the cruel lessons of being Henry VIII's daughter. Before we explore Elizabeth's tale, we must acknowledge that Henry's cruelty was no rash outburst of rage. It was systematic psychological warfare, crafted by a master manipulator who understood precisely how to break the human spirit. Henry not only isolated his children, but weaponized unpredictability in daily life. One day, Mary might be invited for tea in the stately drawing room. The next, forced into menial labor in the servants' quarters. He controlled all communication. Letters she penned vanished, and petitions from courtiers were torn to shreds. Mary learned to distrust every warm smile, for it might belong to one of the king's agents. The most insidious tactic was Henry's wrapping of abuse in the language of paternal love and divine authority. When Mary knelt before the throne, hearing praises such as, "My daughter, the pride of my heart," her spirit fractured under the clash between ostensible adulation and actual cruelty. The king's power, sanctified as sacred, made victims more inclined to accept maltreatment as a form of salvation. With each passing day, Mary awoke to the mingled sounds of birdsong and church bells from the nearby chapel, once soothing melodies that now startled her awake. She washed her face in a basin of cold water, gazing at her reflection in the trembling candlelight, and wondered, could she preserve her true self amid this ocean of suffering? Yet that relentless vigilance forged an unbreakable identity. Mary transformed fear into strength and solitude into the resolve to protect her soul, no matter how merciless the world around her might become. The king's unpredictability kept Mary in a constant state of hyper-arousal. Her nervous system was locked into a perpetual fight-or-flight mode, never afforded a moment's rest or recovery. Each morning upon awakening, her heart raced even before her feet touched the floor. Her surroundings, which had once felt safe, had become a labyrinth of threats. Meals, once an occasion for royal pageantry, transformed into exercises in humiliation. Instead of a grand banquet table laden with imported fruits and delicacies, Mary often ate alone in a side chamber, or in the company of a single loyal servant. Every bite was a reminder of her fallen status. At times, her food portion was meager. At others, it was withheld until she offered a public expression of gratitude for her father's generosity. She felt hunger not enough to endanger her life, but sufficient to constantly remind her of her impotence. Correspondence was Mary's only link to the outside world. Yet every letter was tightly controlled. Messages she wrote to her mother vanished without reply. Words of encouragement from court allies were intercepted, and the writers faced harsh punishment. Even notes sent through intermediaries were torn up or rewritten. stripping away sincerity and any chance at emotional solace. Surrounded by people, Mary was utterly alone. Henry extended his psychological manipulation to her physical environment. Mary's chamber, once adorned with intricately patterned carpets, goose-down pillows, and handcrafted silk drapes, was gradually stripped of its comforts. The colourful Persian rug was removed, replaced by rough linen curtains. Her treasured jewellery vanished, her collection of Latin treatises and Puccini poetry confiscated, and the virginal, a faithful companion in long nights, was locked away. The barren room, devoid of personal touches, reminded her daily of the fleeting nature of royalty. In the dim glow of dusk, Mary would sit by her window, gazing out at the wild gardens where Tudor roses climbed freely. The chilly evening breeze rustled through the leaves, causing her to shiver. The scene outside symbolized the freedom she craved, yet underscored her isolation. The cooing of doves echoed like a taunt. Life continued beyond those walls, while she, the fallen princess, remained trapped in darkness. Every minor detail of her day became a clue to her father's mood. The murmur of voices in the council chamber, the soft thud of a heavy door, a flash of movement behind a curtain. Mary mastered the art of controlled breathing and masked facial expressions to conceal her fear, reminding herself that only vigilance could keep her alive. Though stripped of everything else, she clung to her will to survive. Within that harsh environment, Mary forged an inner strength that no courtier could ever conquer. Perhaps Henry's most cunning tactic was exploiting Mary's deep Catholic faith against her. He understood that religion was not merely belief, but the very lifeline binding Mary to her mother and the source of her emotional strength. Thus, he cloaked his designs in religious pretense, transforming every demand into a test of her faith. When Mary refused to acknowledge him as the supreme head of the church on earth, it wasn't merely political defiance, it was deemed a grave spiritual offense, threatening her eternal salvation. In that maze of canon law, Mary faced the prospect of her soul's ruin if she resisted. This created an almost inescapable psychological paradox. If Mary surrendered, she would break the sacred vows she held dear, betraying her mother and her faith. Yet if she stood firm, she would be branded an unrepentant heretic, condemned to eternal damnation. Picture Mary standing alone in the palace chapel, candlelight dancing across ancient stone walls, prayers echoing through the vaulted ceiling, and her heart torn between corporeal survival and spiritual integrity. Henry further manipulated hope as a psychological lever. Just when Mary seemed resigned to her fate, she might receive a royal sealed letter promising a reunion with her mother or a minor title. Yet days later, that hope would be cruelly snatched away by a court official enforcing another decree of exile. These moments felt like a brief sunrise swallowed by an oncoming storm, chipping away at Mary's resilience. Henry's courtiers, fully versed in his tactics, studied Mary's cycles of hope and despair to time their approaches. When she showed steely resolve, they delivered subtle threats, reminding her of those who opposed the king and paid with their lives. When she appeared weary, they softened their tone, suggesting her father's heart had softened, that a little flexibility would bring instant relief. But such kindness was a trap, further fracturing her spirit. The palace itself mirrored Mary's emotional turmoil. The once lavish corridors lined with ornate tapestries were now faded and tattered, each footstep echoing like a countdown to judgment. Painted frescoes depicting saints and martyrdom seemed to gaze down with sorrow, reflecting the pain she endured. In her modest chamber, a worn prayer book lay open beside a portable altar. Its whispered verses beckoned her to a realm free from suffering, yet abandoning her faith would sever the only tether she had left. Amid the murmurs of prayer and the echoes of footfalls, Mary gradually realized that true strength lay in preserving her faith, even as deception and betrayal surrounded her. She resolved that if she lost her faith, she would lose herself entirely. It was this determination to safeguard her soul that became a faint guiding light in the darkness, steering Mary through the most sophisticated psychological torture imaginable. The alternating pattern of threats and false reassurance kept Mary from developing any consistent coping strategies. Each time she learned to steel herself against the latest intimidation, a sudden guard patrol down the corridor, or the heavy clank of a barred door, another royal attendant would appear with a warm cup of tea and gentle advice on how to reconcile with her father. But if Mary believed in that kindness, the threats returned, slicing through her trust like a double-edged sword. The physical effects of this psychological torture were severe. Mary endured frequent crippling headaches, as if her skull were bound in invisible ropes. Gastrointestinal spasms plagued her daily, forcing her to eat only the smallest morsels. Contemporary records describe uncontrollable crying spells. She would weep on the palace balcony, tears mingling with the night's dew on her cheeks. Her menstrual cycle became erratic, sometimes lasting for weeks, sometimes disappearing entirely, raising political concerns among those hoping for a marriage alliance. This condition not only caused immense physical pain but also diminished her value in the eyes of the court. Sleep offered no reprieve. Mary lay awake, straining to hear footsteps in the corridor, or watching the dark corridor beyond her door, ready to startle upright at any moment. On the rare occasions she managed to drift off, her dreams were haunted by visions of her mother's sobs in a damp, stone-walled chamber, courtroom scenes where she was forced to sign declarations of illegitimacy, and spectres of herself standing before a tribunal, surrounded by jeering crowds. She woke soaked in sweat, her heart pounding like a drum. Henry didn't merely isolate Mary from her mother and friends. He meticulously controlled her entourage. Anyone who showed excessive sympathy was abruptly dismissed. Once beloved ladies-in-waiting vanished in the dead of night, leaving only mournful echoes. Only a handful remained, carefully selected for their pliability, ever ready to remind Mary that life would be easier if she just obeyed. They offered words of comfort. Just heed His Majesty, and you shall be free. Yet the instant Mary showed hesitation, they would vanish too, leaving her with the full weight of her terror. Those who stayed continued to regale her with stories of past dissenters who had knelt before Henry and been spared, alongside cautionary tales of those who defied him and met tragic ends. They spoke of once powerful officials, of Mary's own brother's defiance, and of noble women who disappeared without a trace. Each narrative was a bullet to Mary's heart, reinforcing the belief that only submission could bring peace. Ultimately, Mary's surroundings became an invisible cage. She learned to distrust any semblance of kindness, and to monitor every gesture carefully to avoid provoking her manipulator. Yet it was within this harsh environment that Mary began to forge inner resilience, evolving into an indomitable survivor. She understood that only by maintaining her resolve amid the blade-edge cycles of hope and despair could she preserve her sense of self against the most ruthless of forces. The lesson in universal doubt became etched into Mary's psyche, affecting every relationship thereafter. Henry's psychological warfare was not a series of isolated acts, but a sophisticated system designed to anticipate and neutralize any form of resistance. When Mary sought strength in the model of martyrdom, comparing herself to early Christian saints who died for clear principles, Henry's agents dismissed her comfort outright. They reminded her that saints chose death to uphold unambiguous truths, whereas Mary's defiance was merely stubborn pride, harming her mother and threatening the realm's stability. When she turned to prayer and the solace of God's word, they reframed her suffering as a punishment for disobedience. "If you truly repent," they whispered, "God will forgive you and grant you release." Such enticements did not console but deepened her emotional wounds, causing Mary to question her own worthiness of faith. As memories of happier times flickered a twilight spent listening to her mother recounting the life of St. Agnes under an ancient oak, lessons of Latin and courtly dances in the dying light of dusk, her manipulators seized upon these recollections. Those peaceful moments were illusions, they insisted, designed to bind your heart to falsehood. By systematically reinterpreting nostalgia as deceit, they eroded her confidence in her own sensations. The assault on Mary's perception extended to politics, memory, emotion, and moral judgment, all weaponized against her. Every word, every recollection became a potential tool of manipulation. The result was a pervasive uncertainty. Mary lived perpetually on the edge between truth and falsehood, unable to trust anything. She mastered the art of silence and emotional concealment, knowing any sign of vulnerability could be twisted against her. When Mary finally signed the document declaring herself illegitimate and her mother's marriage invalid, it was not because reason had convinced her, but because Henry's relentless psychological torture had made the distinction between truth and lie feel irrelevant. Ending the pain immediately outweighed, defending her honor or preserving her memories. Under constant pressure threats to her life, her soul, and the fragile hope of reunion with her mother, She conceded to erase herself. Yet, that moment of apparent defeat revealed Mary's inner strength. As the ink dried on the page, she realized that Henry's supreme power could control her body and status, but could not fully conquer her heart or her memories. Though she had lost trust in the world around her, she retained one final piece of herself: the will to survive. Mary emerged from this trial shattered in spirit, but stronger than ever, poised for the difficult journey ahead. Amid the ruins of Mary's spirit, a girl once revered as a princess, then in a single night reduced to a bastard, the darkness of the Tudor court seemed relentless. While Mary grappled with fear and manipulated memories, in another wing of the palace, a different soul was quietly growing under the weight of tragedy. Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister, was only a toddler when her world shattered alongside her mother's death on the execution scaffold. From her tentative first steps in the royal gardens to the cold stone of palace steps, Elizabeth learned her first lesson: love is fragile and conditional. Now, we will follow how that little girl transformed fear into courage, skillfully weaving survival into every breath to become a figure greater than anything her father could have imagined. From the moment she was born in September 1533, Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, was declared illegitimate. The instant her first cry echoed through the royal ward, her title of princess vanished, replaced by the label bastard. Elizabeth arrived in a world that truly wanted her erased. Not just figuratively. Powerful figures at court looked at this red-haired infant and saw only a problem to be eliminated. By the age of 2.5, Elizabeth witnessed her mother being led to the scaffold, branded a traitor and adulteress. She couldn't fully grasp the accusations, only overheard the hushed whispers of servants. Your mother betrayed the king. Unlike Mary, who retained comforting childhood memories of her mother Catherine, Elizabeth had never known true security. The day her mother died, her world collapsed, leaving a chilling void within her young soul. 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry VIII wed Jane Seymour. The wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral was celebrated with joyous fervour by the court. 3-year-old Elizabeth was clad in princely robes and stood among the bridesmaids, watching her father dance with hopeful anticipation. The virginal music filled the cathedral. Candlelight flickered across her innocent face, unaware that such gaiety foreshadowed a darker future. When Edward, the son Henry so longed for, was born in November 1537, both Elizabeth and Mary suddenly became superfluous. The newborn's cry rang throughout the palace, shattering the air with triumph. The sisters stood quietly in the marble corridor, their eyes wide as a small crown was placed upon Edward's head. They understood then that their worth was measured by gender and the ability to produce a male heir. From her earliest steps, Elizabeth learned her first life lesson. A girl's value could change in an instant. Every later portrait of her bore a look of steely resolve touched by sorrow. She saw foreign diplomats' smiles praising her beauty and intellect, yet nearby, whispers warned, "She won't live long if she displeases the king." In her small private chamber, Elizabeth treasured an old Latin prayer book, a gift from her mother. She devoured each line as if seeking refuge in its words. The wind whispered through the slightly ajar window, mingling with distant church bells, reminding her of the world beyond the cold palace walls. Morning light filtering through silk drapes illuminated a young face that already bore the marks of resilience. The gardens outside ancient yews, tulips in bloom, a serene carp pond remained lush and vibrant. Yet in Elizabeth's mind, every scene carried a note of melancholy. She learned to interpret the rustling leaves as servants' whispers, to anticipate whose footsteps might approach, and whether today she would be hidden in silence or summoned to court. From those early days, Elizabeth planted a growing ambition, to become not merely a princess, but an indomitable symbol. Within those stone walls, she resolved that one day she would stand upon the throne not because of birth, but through inner strength and intellect. And that first lesson in conditional worth became the fuel that drove her to rise above every constraint the court imposed. The day that changed Elizabeth's life forever came on the 19th of May, 1536. That day, the toddler of 2 years and 8 months was playing in the royal manor's garden, where birdsong mingled with the scent of tea roses and a gentle breeze created an idyllic scene. Suddenly, a messenger arrived bearing grim news. Her mother, Queen Anne Boleyn, had been executed for treason, adultery, and incest. Pause, and imagine it. An infant under 3 hearing that the woman who gave her life was beheaded before the world. Elizabeth could have no clear memories of her mother, except for the servants' whispered tales and the solemn proclamation in the Royal Gazette. Anne Boleyn was a traitor. But Elizabeth's tragedy eclipsed Mary's. Mary had at least tasted unconditional love from Catherine, while Elizabeth had never known safety. From the moment her mother fell, her life entered a realm of perpetual deprivation, borrowed honour, borrowed power, borrowed hope. Immediately after the execution, Henry declared Elizabeth illegitimate. Like Mary before her, the little girl was stripped of title, inheritance rights, and royal status. Succession laws were abruptly rewritten, erasing her from the line to the throne. No more ceremonial honours, no more privileges. Elizabeth was cast to history's margins the instant she uttered her first cry. Unlike Mary, Elizabeth had no nurturing embrace of Catherine to shelter her. The Boleyn family, once esteemed, swiftly distanced themselves to avoid scandal. All legal rights, all diplomatic protections afforded to her lineage, were revoked. At the age of 3, Elizabeth stood utterly alone in a vast palace where the virginal's melody still lingered. Her devoted tutor, Catherine "Cat" Ashley, became her first confidant. In her memoirs, she recalled, "Each day, Elizabeth asked about her mother. I could only repeat that her mother had gone away, but could not explain that she had gone in tragedy. The brutal truth was too cruel. Lies felt like betrayal. With no one to question, Elizabeth learned to keep silence as a means of survival, stowing away every emotion in her young heart. Yet, her psychological horror extended beyond her mother's death. In the days that followed, she witnessed Henry discard one wife after another with the brutality of a serial executioner. 11 days after Anne's fall, Jane Seymour was wed, and 3-year-old Elizabeth was forced to attend the wedding, watching her father celebrate alongside his new bride. The bells, the dancing, and the triumphant fervour of the court masked her own agony. Months later, Jane gave birth to Henry's much-desired son, Edward and Elizabeth. Just as scripted, was relegated once again to the shadows of uselessness. Everything unfolded too swiftly for a toddler learning to walk. She realized her worth was measured in numbers, a pawn on the political chessboard. Yet from that precarious position, Elizabeth gleaned her first lesson in survival. She must protect herself above all else. Life within the Tudor palace became her harshest classroom, teaching her about power, betrayal, and the art of adaptation. Those tentative steps marked the beginning of her journey to transform pain into strength, so that one day, the once illegitimate princess would ascend the throne with autonomy and pride. When Henry married Jane Seymour just 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution, the Tudor court swelled with a strange mixture of celebration and disquiet. The wedding took place in the grand hall draped with royal carpets and candlelight. The virginal's melody filled the room, and nobles in lavish attire offered congratulations. Yet, in the adjacent rose garden with its cool stone paths and lingering floral scents, a 3-year-old girl was forced to witness it all. Her mother's dried blood still stained the cobblestones, and the scent of roses felt misplaced against the backdrop of tragedy. Elizabeth, with her bright auburn curls shimmering in the afternoon sun, was led to a raised dais beside a temporary throne. The crowd's excitement contrasted sharply with her wide, confused eyes. The toddler gripped her tutor, Catherine "Cat" Ashley's hand, seeking reassurance. In Elizabeth's mind, 2 messages were carved indelibly: that she would only matter again if Jane bore a son, and that without such a child, she would remain forgotten. Within weeks, Jane became pregnant, and Elizabeth learned another bitter lesson about her worth. Each stride her father took across the marble floor seemed to determine her fate. If the unborn baby were male, she would vanish into obscurity. If not, her chance to rise might return. At last, in October of 1537, the royal household rejoiced at the birth of Prince Edward. Cannons thundered, church bells tolled, and military parades flaunted banners in the sky. The crowd cheered for the new heir as Elizabeth, now the shadow of history, watched from behind a column. She was no longer the cherished princess. She was a phantom in her father's quest for a male successor. Yet out of that neglect and danger, a resilient spark ignited within Elizabeth. She refused to succumb to despair. Instead, she transformed indifference and peril into the drive to excel. The virginal's gentle notes in the garden became exercises in mental discipline, and each glance from the courtiers became a lesson in reading people. Elizabeth scrutinized every expression and gesture, arming herself with skills even Mary had never acquired. Within the palace's dim corridors, she practiced retaining calm in the face of fear, learning precisely when to smile and when to veil her emotions behind lowered eyelids. She crept into the library, teaching herself with each volume of history, mythology, and royal lore. Every page added to her arsenal of self-knowledge and inner strength. Winter cast long shadows over the courtyard as Edward grew, and Elizabeth slowly reclaimed her confidence. By the hearth, she chatted quietly with Cat Ashley, knitting a warm scarf to ward off the north wind. The firelight and the tutor's gentle whispers cocooned her spirit. There she realized the crucial truth. True power begins with self-protection and self-understanding, and in the heart of a once timid child, now quietly absorbing leadership skills, another journey took flight. The quest to turn pain into power and wounds into empathy, so that someday soon, Elizabeth would ascend to the pinnacle of authority, unshakable in her resolve. By the time she was 6 years old, the Tudor palace had become Elizabeth's entire world. Long corridors bathed in the late afternoon sun, stained glass windows casting golden hues, and climbing rose arbors etching shadows onto cold stone floors. At this age, she displayed a sharp intellect that amazed everyone around her. Each day she crossed the gravel courtyard to a silent study room, where 3 renowned tutors took turns, teaching her ancient languages and complex philosophical concepts. Latin rolled off her tongue like music, Greek flowed softly, and French and Italian whispered secrets from southern lands. She drank in theology, studying the church fathers and scripture, pondering how faith could become a weapon sharper than any blade. She turned pages of history, captivated by tales of Rome, Greece, France, and distant political upheavals. The room's oratory exercises, standing before stoic stone busts of her tutors, brought her training vividly to life. Yet beneath her eager eyes lay a child constantly observing. Every gesture from her tutors, a glance through thin spectacles, an encouraging smile became a data point she carefully recorded in her tiny notebook. The tapestries adorning the study, hunts in forests, noble gatherings served as sources of inspiration, but also information. Elizabeth realized that knowledge would not just help her survive, but serve as her shield. She also took note of the other children. The Earl's grandson, shyly wandering the hallways, and a tiny duke's heir trailing behind his parents, shrinking when the word royalty floated by. Elizabeth watched them, understanding that status was never permanent. One day beloved, the next erased. Silently she vowed to make herself indispensable. In quiet moments by the tea table in the garden, she remembered every guest. The man sipping tea from a lion, engraved gold cup, the noble pouring wine from a crystal decanter, the emissary who spoke of distant lands. She realized that forming connections was not mere protocol but a survival network. Every relationship, every thankful smile, every gentle glance could one day save her life. When night fell, Elizabeth returned to her private chamber, settling at her camel-hide desk. Candlelight flickered on parchment as she reviewed her lessons. Cicero's speeches, Ovid's verses, Italian grammar, and even how to pose questions that demanded answers. She asked herself, "Am I safe enough? Am I important enough not to be cast aside?" The answer flickered like the candle flame, but in that space, her will grew stronger. Elizabeth's intellect was not just academic. It was the art of self-preservation, the art of transforming every word, every relationship, every silent moment into a solid psychological armor. It was this meticulous calculation and hunger for survival that transformed the once fragile child into Elizabeth, the immortal queen of an empire few could ever reach. Elizabeth's education evolved into something far more sinister than mere refinement for a Renaissance princess. It was not just the mastery of European languages and culture, but a masterclass in espionage, manipulation, and survival. From an early age, she did not choose her subjects. Instead, every lesson was a vital requirement to preserve her life in a court where children's lives were the ultimate political currency. By the time Elizabeth was 7, she had perfected the art of eavesdropping on adults without arousing any suspicion. In the study, she would sit quietly at her embroidery desk or pore over thick Latin texts, her eyes seemingly tracing each line of script, while her mind absorbed every whisper around her. She learned to identify the gossiping servant versus the trustworthy aide, the noble visiting with foreign intelligence, and the courtier rising or falling under her father's favour. Her tutors, astonished by her linguistic prowess, unwittingly became her instructors in life or death skills. When they praised her for swiftly mastering French and Italian, they did not realize they taught her to decode secret conversations, words they believed children could not comprehend. And when they marveled at her flawless historical recall, they failed to notice she was practicing the art of memorizing faces, names, and relationship skills that might one day save her life. Even the palace grounds became part of her schooling. The fragrant rose garden was where she learned to track footsteps by the morning dew, and the shadowy hallways lit by flickering candles became her training ground for discerning approaching steps. Every stained glass window, carrying scents from the banquet halls, revealed details about the meals served and the hosts who favoured them. Privacy ceased to exist. Letters intended for her were intercepted by Elizabeth when she discreetly unlocked the small desk drawer. Freshly scribed parchment and damp ink became clues for her to deduce who attempted to erase evidence. The quiet courtyard where she once hid to read poems transformed into a vantage point for analysing hastily scrawled administrative orders, allowing her to predict who faced punishment or transfer. Every moment of the day was part of her survival curriculum. She learned to choose seats near windows for better eavesdropping, and to smile in measured ways that concealed her anxiety. By night, as the palace settled into dim lamplight, Elizabeth would return to her chamber, light a candle, and record the day's events. Who watched her, who whispered, who showed concern, and who celebrated her distress. Her small notebook blossomed into a mental map, guiding her through safe routes, reliable allies, and dangerous enemies. Through this sophisticated education, Elizabeth emerged not only as a scholar of extraordinary breadth, but also as a master of concealment, manipulation, and survival amidst the storm of power. This rigorous training wove resilience into her very soul, preparing her for the extraordinary journey that would crown her as one of England's most legendary queens. Elizabeth's famed composure, the regal silence that later made her a powerful queen, was in fact a trauma response forged in her childhood. From a very young age, she understood that any sign of vulnerability on her face could be seized upon as a pretext for scrutiny, judgment, or even punishment. In the early misty mornings, when pale sunlight streamed through slender wooden windows, Elizabeth would sit before a small ivory mirror, quietly studying her reflection. She would imagine hearing the news of her mother's execution, or confronting dire threats, then practice a sorrow that did not overflow into tears, or calmness that did not slip into coldness. The Tudor palace resounded with the clatter of horseshoes, the hum of musicians tuning their instruments, and the low murmur of courtiers debating state affairs. Amid this chaos, Elizabeth learned to gauge every passing glance as she walked the corridors. She knew that an ill-timed smile could be misconstrued as mockery, and the faintest frown could arouse suspicion. Thus, she honed the art of compressing all emotion into a facade, her face an impenetrable wall behind which no thought could be discerned. In the afternoons, when cool breezes rustled through the cedar alleys of the royal gardens, Elizabeth would retreat beneath a leafy canopy, feigning embroidery while her mind catalogued every shift in the atmosphere. A single fallen leaf might startle her, for she understood that even the subtlest movement in the garden could signal a secret meeting or a consequential order from her father. To her, nowhere was ever truly safe, not even the most beautiful of places. By night, as candlelight danced across cold stone walls, Elizabeth practiced steady breathing exercises to regulate her heartbeat against all disturbances. She referred to this as her calming ritual, closing her eyes to imagine a servant kneeling in supplication, then modulating her inhale and exhale to conceal any trace of joy or tension. With each repetition, she ingrained the discipline of emotional self-control, transforming feeling into a tool rather than a vulnerability. Unlike her peers, who spent hours learning dance steps and musical pieces, Elizabeth devoted endless time to perfecting her expressions, body language, and vocal tone. She experimented with subtle inflections, postural adjustments, and the gentlest nod to discover which gestures inspired the most trust. The palace itself became her school. Every conversation, every courtly ceremony, an opportunity to refine her persona. When subjects admired Elizabeth's stoicism amid the maelstrom, They could not know that behind that serene veneer lay a fierce internal struggle. Each polite smile, each reserved glance, every measured motion had been painstakingly crafted small weapons in her arsenal of survival. This mastery of emotional disguise not only saw her through the most perilous years, but laid the foundation for the poised, formidable, and unyielding bearing that would define her reign as the illustrious Virgin Queen. But perhaps most tragic of all, Elizabeth learned these skills not by choice, but out of absolute necessity. Every morning when she awoke, she was greeted by the splendor and power that filled the Tudor palace. The hurried footsteps of attendants, the whispered conversations of courtiers, and the flickering candlelight against the cold stone walls. In that world, concealing genuine emotion and presenting a safe face became paramount. Elizabeth understood that a single lie could save her life, while the tiniest frown might cast her under suspicion. Her relationship with food became another suffocating aspect of survival. While lavish banquets still showcased platters of pastries, roasted meats, and fine wines, Elizabeth received only modest portions, often a sliver of meat or a few vegetables as a test of obedience. She swiftly learned to consume each morsel without betraying any reaction. Any sign of delight in flavor or distaste for a dish was deemed a dangerous display of pride or ingratitude. And when no more food was offered afterward, leaving her hungry, it reminded her that her father's power could sever both her physical nourishment and her spirit. Elizabeth also mastered the art of eating quickly. She would swallow bite after bite in an instant, knowing that at any moment she might be summoned to appear before the king or his representatives. This habit followed her into adulthood. She often dined standing at her writing desk, nibbling while handling documents, because she never permitted herself the luxury of leisure or the vulnerability of appearing weak. Even in later years, she ate in her private chambers, multitasking between nourishment and governance, as though full relaxation were a privilege she could never afford. Elizabeth's sleep was heavily affected by perpetual vigilance. She became a light sleeper. The softest footsteps echoing outside the corridor, or the faintest unusual sound in her chamber, would rouse her instantly. In the darkness, she perfected the swift ritual of donning her cloak and grasping her fan or hair ribbon to look presentable at a moment's notice if unexpectedly summoned. Before closing her eyes, she placed a small oil lamp, a sheet of paper, and a quill beside her pillow tools. She might need to jot down anxious thoughts or important notes in the dead of night. Her dreams were seldom peaceful. When she did manage deep sleep, her mind unraveled scenarios of confinement and escape, racing through stone-floored corridors, slipping into a silent garden, hiding in a grain storehouse, or barricading behind ancient wooden doors. In these dreams, she heard distant screams, the harsh bark of watchmen, and felt herself pleading for freedom. Upon waking, she would let out a quiet sigh of relief, yet she never dared to linger in restful slumber for long. All of these tactics, eating as an act of submissive ritual, sleep shrouded by nightmares, were born from the urgent need to survive in Henry's palace. They transformed a little princess into an expert in vigilance and self-control, while engraving into her soul the harsh lesson that mere survival demanded constant concealment of self. Elizabeth often awoke in the night with vivid memories of dream conversations, where she deftly avoided political traps and discovered persuasive turns of phrase. Upon waking, she would quickly jot down every line, knowing that a single clever rebuttal or well-placed question could determine her fate in an upcoming audience. These dreams were not mere fancies, but rehearsal sessions, shaping her readiness to face the king's inquiries about loyalty or navigate disputes among power-hungry courtiers. While her peers learned courtly bows and practiced ceremonial dances, Elizabeth cultivated a rare skill, reading others by their eyes, voices, and breath. She could sense when a courtier hesitated to judge her reactions, when a seemingly innocent question harbored malice, and when a warm compliment masked envy or a veiled threat. By observing the flicker of torchlight across their faces, Elizabeth honed her ability to detect subtle shifts in mood. Moreover, Elizabeth practiced delivering safe yet polite responses. She understood that any statement made too emphatically could be used against her later. Instead, she favored open-ended remarks enough to maintain goodwill, but avoiding binding herself to any single position. When asked about religious policy, she spoke of faith and compassion, pleasing both Catholic and reformist factions. When praised for her scholarship, she graciously shifted to discussing the realm's welfare, deflecting attention from personal ambition. This deft communication allowed Elizabeth to cultivate a refined public persona. The trade-off was that she had to suppress genuine emotions. Joy, sorrow, and anxiety were all hidden behind her flawless facade. When a visiting dignitary presented her with flowers, she responded with a gentle smile, even if loneliness weighed heavily on her heart. When favored attendants engaged her in light-hearted banter, she replied graciously, all the while mentally noting which alliances held true and which masked ulterior motives. Her surroundings were opulent halls with soaring vaulted ceilings, carved with dragons and phoenixes, gilt walls, and Persian rugs ablaze with colour. Yet to Elizabeth, each step on the intricately patterned stone floor echoed like an alarm. Someone was watching, ready to judge her next move. Surrounded by ancestral portraits and sculptures of St. George, she learned to embody power itself, a master of subtlety and composure. From dream rehearsals to real-life exchanges, Elizabeth gradually perfected a special quality: the ability to adapt to any situation while preserving her own poise. Though still a young girl, every word, gesture, and glance laid the foundation for a queen who understood the essence of human nature and power. It was this skill set that would guide her through decades of rule, transforming her into an enduring icon of wisdom and resilience amidst a landscape riddled with peril. At the age of 8, Elizabeth witnessed yet another tragic chapter. Catherine Howard, only slightly older than Mary, was crowned Henry's 5th queen. Once again, the Tudor court turned a young girl into a political spectacle. Elizabeth watched Catherine stride in resplendent gowns, wearing the crown of power, only for the scene to shift less than 2 years later to the execution scaffold, where the cold block claimed the life of another stepmother. Blood and tears stained the stone, a chilling reminder that women under Henry's power were never safe. After 6 marriages and 2 executions, Elizabeth learned that beneath the cloak of authority lay betrayal's icy price. She recalled Mary stripped of her rank, then restored when it served political ends. She saw how swiftly loyalty could shift when ambition dictated. These lessons etched themselves into her mind, teaching her that familial love could abandon a person at any moment. The most haunting moment came when she turned 10. Henry, now suffering from a festering leg wound and erratic mood swings, casually asked her opinion on marriage one afternoon. In the grand hall, under trembling candlelight, Elizabeth, just a 10-year-old child, answered in a calm, measured tone. She believed marriage to be a perilous trap for a woman, and longed to live and die in untouched purity. Her response froze the room. Courtiers whispered in disbelief that a child, so scarred by treachery and bloodshed, could internalize such profound lessons about power and safety. To grasp why she answered this way, one must look back at the years she spent under the shadow of extreme turmoil. Elizabeth saw her mother fall before the executioner's sword, witnessed her sister Mary endure psychological torture until forced to renounce her very identity. She observed every detail of the trials: the sickening crack of the axe, the merciless gaze of officials, reminders that every step in the court was a gamble with one's life. In the castle courtyard, once rosy gardens lay overgrown with weeds, and statues of saints were cloaked in moss. Morning light sifted through ancient windows, casting long shadows on cracked walls. These images, and the echo of guards' footsteps, formed the backdrop of Elizabeth's enduring fear. She learned to remain silent during political discussions, to tread as softly as a bird wary of creaking floorboards. From fleeting pleasures in the royal court to solemn lessons in the chamber, Elizabeth carried the dread of abandonment with her. Every smile, every greeting, every moment of composed observation became a protective act. Though only 10, she bore the experience of someone seasoned by hardship. She knew that to survive, she had to become more observant than any prince, keen to spot danger in a glance or a hush, and strong enough to conceal her fears from all. And so, at the age of 10, Elizabeth made a survival decision: to avoid the wounds that marriage inflicted. When her father, with a mocking smile and gleaming eyes, called her his little philosopher, Elizabeth refused to take it as praise. It was a survival instinct honed through years of watching the women she loved ascend the scaffold. From her hurried footsteps down the cold stone corridor, she understood that marriage was not a romantic ritual, but a trap that could erase her identity. The most horrifying lesson in Elizabeth's childhood was not only what Henry VIII did to her, but what he taught a child about trust and love. She learned that anyone she placed her faith in could turn into an enemy, that affection was merely a temporary contract, and that any moment of vulnerability could lead to death. When she strolled through the palace gardens, gazing at the trembling wildflowers in the morning dew, she saw not only beauty, but sensed the fragility of every budding life. While Mary endured both physical and emotional deprivation, Elizabeth witnessed the painful consequences of inadequate medical care and harsh surveillance. Her health suffered as well. She became thin, pale, and often complained of persistent stomach pain. At night she woke with cramps, her heart racing like a caged bird, fearful of the slightest sound in the corridor. She learned to dress herself in royal garments in the dark, nimble fingers fastening buttons, ever ready for an emergency summons. One evening, Elizabeth sat by a large window, watching moonlight filter through a honeycomb-patterned roof. The night breeze carried scents of cedar and the faint aroma of courtly pipe smoke. She felt the invisible weight of the palace, the place where power was woven from thunder, where smiles could pierce the heart. From the flagstones underfoot to each wooden beam overhead, everything bore a shade of cold calculation and danger. Yet Elizabeth did not crumble. She transformed fear into strength. She became unnervingly composed. Her face betrayed no emotion, her gaze quietly absorbing every shift in mood. In that silence, she honed her observational mind, analyzing the postures of courtiers, noting the cadence of footsteps, and memorizing the familiar fragrance of each servant. All of these details became precious tools for adaptation. Every night before sleep, Elizabeth whispered to herself, to remain steadfast, never allow kindness to weaken her final line of defense. Upon waking from fractured dreams, she recalled the scenarios she had rehearsed, evading capture, skillfully responding to accusations, and above all, keeping the flame of hope alive within her small heart. In the pale glow of night, she felt strongly that she would become a living symbol of extraordinary resilience rising above the terror her father sown, so that one day she would rule the kingdom with the reason and caution forged in her childhood. When Mary fell gravely ill in 1535, initially Henry VIII refused to let doctors tend to her, claiming that her illness was merely a ploy for sympathy. Only when foreign ambassadors began to express serious concern in letters did Henry relent, allowing her to receive medical treatment. However, even in the sickbed chamber, Mary could not escape surveillance. Physicians were charged not only with recording her physical symptoms, but also reporting every word and emotional state. Anytime Mary coughed or gasped for breath, they noted it as a potential sign of political resistance. In the king's eyes, Mary's illness became a political weapon. The infirmary was guarded by watchful sentries, windows tightly shut to prevent news from leaking out. Every sound from Mary's groans to the rare, optimistic smile was relayed back to the palace to assess whether she remained cooperative. The chamber itself became a net, offering no medical comfort, but only further deprivation of privacy. Meanwhile, Elizabeth too suffered the aftermath of their shared childhood trauma. From an early age she was thin, pallid, and prone to anxious habits like nail-biting and plucking at her clothes. Royal secretaries described her as slender as a willow, with eyes dull of youthful wonder. She endured relentless insomnia. Sometimes she would lie awake all night, listening to footsteps outside her door, wondering if bad news or an urgent summons awaited. On top of that, Elizabeth began showing signs of an eating disorder. For weeks on end, she would nibble stale bread and limp boiled vegetables, never enough to satisfy hunger. Then, under extreme stress, she would devour a platter of honey cakes or gulp down thick broth. Her tutors and attendants realized that for Elizabeth, food was not merely sustenance, but the only aspect of her life she could still control. Every morsel she consumed was a survival strategy, a way to reclaim a small measure of power within a court of intrigue. The surroundings of both sisters equally reflected the melancholy. The grand halls, once resplendent with ruby tapestries, were now draped with heavy curtains. The flickering candlelight cast pallid shadows on cold stone walls. The palace gardens where roses and lilies once bloomed in abundance now lay silent. The flower beds were meticulously trimmed into rigid lines, mirroring the absolute control exerted over the sisters. Peacock plumes, once proudly displayed, now trafficked the ground quietly, as if sharing in the unseen sorrow. Every minute detail from the whistling wind through the window slits the faint tap of Mary's gown as she moved, to the damp, musty scent of the study contributed to the grim backdrop. Under Henry's rule, illness and nutrition ceased to be basic needs, becoming psychological weapons that eroded the last defenses of human spirit. Mary and Elizabeth matured in a world where even their own bodies were manipulated by their father, and every motion, every breath, could be construed as an act of defiance. As Elizabeth grew up in the shadows of the palace, learning to turn fear into strength, in another corridor, her only brother was enduring equally harsh trials. Edward Tudor was born amidst the court's joyful celebration, yet from his very first day, his life was dictated by political schemes. From an isolated childhood to lessons in power taught with unseen blows, Edward was more than the heir to the throne. He became both a tool and a victim in his father's ever-cruel game of power. Let us now enter Edward's story to see how a king transformed his own son into both instrument and casualty of ambition. Edward Tudor, later known as King Edward VI of England, was born on the 12th of October, 1537, as the only legitimate son of King Henry VIII and Queen Jane Seymour. From the moment he arrived on the feather bed in Whitehall Palace, his birth was celebrated as the arrival of a long-awaited male heir, promising to resolve the succession crisis that had plagued the realm. Yet even the joyous peals of church bells could not mask the reality that Edward would grow up under relentless scrutiny, separated from his mother in early childhood, and drawn into political machinations almost from the moment he took his first breath. Edward Tudor grew up not only under the splendour of the throne, but also under the weight of expectations and deep loneliness. Although supplied with rich nutrition and top medical care, his body remained unusually slight. Modern medicine might label this condition as physical underdevelopment. Edward appeared much smaller than his peers, despite enjoying lavish meals of meat, fish, and fresh fruit. He was prone to minor illnesses. A mild fever or a sore throat could confine him to bed for days. Even more striking were the clear signs of chronic anxiety. From early childhood, Edward frequently hunched his shoulders during solemn ceremonies, as if bearing an invisible burden. Whenever the palace doors slammed shut, his eyes would startle, scanning the room in alarm. At night, in his velvet-draped chamber, the mere footsteps of guards in the corridor were enough to rouse him. He quickly learned how to don his robes perfectly, so that if summoned unexpectedly to his father's presence, he would appear without raising suspicion. Court observers noted that Edward slept very little, often napping only a few hours before staring at the ceiling. His dreams were no refuge. He envisioned himself standing on a battlefield, the heavy crown on his head, surrounded by shadowy figures poised to draw their swords. Upon waking, Edward tried to remember every detail, believing these dreams carried messages essential for preparing him to be the rightful king upon whose shoulders the court's hopes rested. The physical environment offered him no childlike comforts. Edward's bedroom was decorated with chilly war scenes and portraits of past monarchs. There were no bright toys, only military maps and manuals. He often sat quietly at his study table, amid the scent of ink on calfskin and oak-scented bookshelves, memorizing essays on military strategy. The lack of childhood respite led Edward to adopt a habit of self-isolation, convincing himself that play was a luxury unfit for the enormous task he carried. Rich nutrition was not a panacea. Despite being served 4 wholesome courses daily, Edward frequently ate very little, sometimes only a light portion before pausing to attend ceremonies or audiences. During peak stress, he would devour food, as if attempting to fill a void not just in his body, but in his spirit. At times, he would collapse onto the table, his hand trembling, eyes glistening, clear signs of a young soul craving warmth and reassurance. All these signs, his slight frame, hunched shoulders, startled responses, fitful sleep, anxiety, and a fraught relationship with food, painfully reveal the truth. Edward Tudor was forced to grow up in an environment not of love and protection, but designed to forge a heart hardened against all emotion. His physical frailty was not merely a residue of sickness. It was a delicate shield protecting his tender spirit from the wounds inflicted by power. Henry VIII's psychological torture was not limited to invisible threats. It intertwined relentlessly with physical suffering. Mary, once a revered Tudor princess, endured chronic headaches like stabbing daggers, persistent stomach cramps, and wildly irregular menstrual cycles, all symptoms of prolonged stress. When Mary fell gravely ill, Henry initially refused medical care, dismissing her condition as a ploy for pity. Only after foreign ambassadors intervened did he relent, yet he continued to monitor every word and gesture. Mary's sickbed ceased to be a place of rest, and became a stage for guards to scrutinize her every movement without mercy. Elizabeth, Mary's younger half-sister, bore her own marks of stress. Her frame was rail-thin, her complexion ghostly pale, and her eyes always flickered with anxiety. Her hands would automatically bite nails or pinch her gown at the slightest unease. She experienced eating disorders, fasting for days on end, then devouring food in panic, as if to fill an emotional void. Sleep offered no respite. Nightmares of the executioner's blade and political rituals jolted her awake, leaving her trapped between fear and fatigue. Edward, the sole male heir, was not spared these wounds, physical and mental. In spite of the finest nutrition and medical care, he remained small, fragile, and prone to illness. Court physicians observed him living in a perpetual state of tension. His shoulders hunched as though carrying an invisible burden, his startled response overstated at every sudden noise. He had no real friends or privacy. Only rigorous study and discipline served as the thin shield protecting his fragile psyche. Their surroundings shifted at Henry's cruel whim. A loyal servant one day could be dismissed the next. A lavish chamber emptied of furnishings and left bare. Books were limited to permitted volumes. Clothing issued only in the colours and fashions pleasing to the king. Mary was confined to a cramped suite. Elizabeth was continually relocated among palaces, and Edward dwelt in a secluded pavilion, isolated from all peers. This physical instability meant none of them could predict the dawn of another turbulent day, their lives tossed like fragile petals in a storm. These combined effects, headaches, illness, sleepless nights, eating disorders, hyper-alertness, ever-changing living conditions united into a profound shared trauma. 3 royal children trapped in a relentless fight between survival and the preservation of their very souls. To survive, Mary developed an inner detachment skill and a public mask to appease the crowd. During every cold interrogation, she would sit upright, her gaze as calm as ice, while her heart silently bled. She learned to hide every tear, every rapid heartbeat, ensuring her inquisitors saw only an unfortunate princess who was never weak. This ability allowed her to endure invisible but fierce mental battles, but left deep scars in her soul. When she became a wife, a mother, or prepared to be queen, Mary always maintained a perfect, composed exterior, never revealing a fraction of her inner pain. This helped her stand strong amid power storms, but also robbed her of genuine moments of love, never letting herself feel the true flutter of affection or being truly loved. Elizabeth, on the other hand, developed a hypervigilant reflex. From the first moments awake, she learned to read the expressions, tones, and gestures of anyone before her. A fleeting frown or subtle change in pitch was enough for her to sense shifting dynamics. She scrutinized who was an enemy and who was a temporary ally. Every conversation became a political map needing decoding. This skill later made Elizabeth a masterful diplomatic queen, skillfully negotiating alliances and avoiding conflict. Yet it also trapped her behind an emotional moat, never lowering her guard, always keeping her heart at a distance so no one could breach. Edward, by contrast, learned to intellectualize emotion. Every personal experience, from the grief of losing his mother to the burden of succession, was translated into a political or religious problem to solve. When signing a death warrant, he treated it like completing a school exercise, without hesitation or wavering. This trait helped Edward remain composed on the throne, warding off emotional shocks that might have crushed him. But it also meant he never knew genuine affection, never understood love beyond duty and honor. When Henry died in 1547, 13-year-old Elizabeth, twice declared illegitimate, had no support except her own ruthlessness and understanding of power. She had to prepare for a new tragic act, with her persecutors not from outside, but her own siblings. The sister who once bent to her father's will, and the brother who saw cruelty as a lesson. In the haunted shadows of the Tudor court, each of Henry VIII's 3 children carried their own shield, yet none found true peace. Edward VI ascended the throne at only 9 years old, but real power lay entirely in the hands of those around him. The first to seize authority was his uncle, Duke Edward Seymour, appointed as protector. Seymour was like a general manipulating pieces on a board. Whenever Edward expressed agreement with him, the boy was praised and granted small favours. But the moment Edward showed a hint of independence, affection dried up like a parched spring. In that tense atmosphere, young Edward crowned yet utterly isolated learned day by day to sign ruthless edicts. He placed lands under blockade, seized the properties of the disobedient, and even signed death warrants for rebels. The horrifying truth was that he did so without hesitation, feeling a twisted sense of pride, as if these harsh measures proved his early maturity as a king. By the time Edward turned 12, Seymour's power was usurped by John Dudley, later the Duke of Northumberland. Dudley continued to use Edward as a pawn, but his tactic was now to divide familial loyalties. He exploited the prince's deep Protestant faith, constantly reminding Edward that his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth posed a threat to the new religion they were taught to defend. Dudley's insidious whispers made Edward view his own bloodline through the lens of betrayal. Mary and Elizabeth suddenly became enemies of the realm, deserving of acts of treason. Torn between family bonds and words from those in power, Edward reluctantly complied. Consequently, he signed further decrees that made his very sisters targets of his political maneuvers, without a shred of regret or hesitation. By 15, Edward's body had grown frail and emaciated. The relentless illness ravaged him despite the finest medical care available. Injections, potions, every measure failed to save him from fever and physical decline. In his fevered delirium, he was still coerced by Dudley to sign his will, bequeathing the crown to Lady Jane Grey, Dudley's daughter-in-law, effectively bypassing Mary and Elizabeth. This act sparked an inevitable civil war. The Tudor dynasty trembled, its currents of power swirling violently, dragging fragile lives along. Edward passed away on the 6th of July, 1553 in Greenwich, leaving a fractured empire, its pillars of authority shattered. With his passing, the throne sat cold and vacant, the succession scrambled beyond repair. Mary and Elizabeth, once opposed by Edward, now emerged from political shadows, poised to claim their destinies. Yet the scars from his reign under Seymour and Dudley lingered, deep psychological wounds, a loss of trust, and a family no longer a refuge but a haunting battleground. Immediately after Edward's death, the Duke of Northumberland wasted no time installing Jane Grey as the 9 Days Queen. Jane was only 16, exquisitely educated, and harboured no genuine desire for the throne. She was merely a political pawn in a game of power. Completely isolated without family or friends, Jane found herself surrounded only by Northumberland's courtiers. She felt like a bird in a cage, her voice trembling as she prayed for divine forgiveness, fully aware she was a misplaced piece on the political board. Meanwhile, Mary Tudor, now 37 years old, had steel forged in her soul after 2 decades of her father's psychological torment. She swiftly gathered her loyal supporters, proclaiming her rightful inheritance as Henry's firstborn daughter. In a matter of 9 brief days, Mary's forces swept into London, warmly welcomed by the populace. They recognized her as the legitimate heir, not the frail young Jane. Jane was immediately arrested and taken to the Tower of London, where the tragic story of an innocent girl would be forever etched in history. Mary could have chosen mercy, but she had learned her father's ruthless lesson well. In the Tudor world, there was no room for weakness and no tolerance for opponents. Jane realized this stark truth as Jane's own supporters were arrested and punished one by one. On the 12th of February 1554, Jane Grey lost her head on Tower Green, at just 16 years old. Her death resounded as a chilling warning to anyone who might dare challenge the throne. Mary Tudor was not to be trifled with. She would rule with the same unwavering authority as Henry VIII before her. She had proven that under her reign, succession was not merely a matter of blood but of power and relentless determination. Ascending to the throne in 1553, Mary Tudor wielded the full power of her personal tragedy. The pain of losing her mother, the humiliation inflicted by her father, once Europe's most formidable king, and the sting of betrayal by both her half-sister and half-brother. Without hesitation, she restored Catholicism as the state religion and mercilessly punished Protestant followers. Over 300 souls were marched to the pyre and burned alive, in grim spectacles that sent shivers through all of Europe. Each bonfire was not merely a medieval rite condemning heresy, it was Mary's bold assertion of power. She showed the court that she was no pushover, that she possessed the courage to rule as a king might. The flames that consumed Oxford martyrs, or burned at Smithfield, were testaments to her resolve to extinguish reform and reignite the old faith. Mary defended these brutal displays by claiming she saved souls through the purifying fires, guiding souls toward repentance and heavenly salvation. Yet, as she watched the conflagrations with rapt horror, her face betrayed a dark satisfaction, something no solemn painting could fully capture. Her delight in wielding newly reclaimed power was almost palpable as she tracked each flicker of flame. At the same time, Mary pursued an heir of her own, her fervent desire to birth a son to secure the Tudor legacy. She anticipated triumph, only to be met with repeated phantom pregnancies. Each time hope soared, it was cruelly dashed, leaving her hollow and mocked by courtiers. They whispered that these false pregnancies were a psychological scar left by her lifelong burden of father-to-son expectation. Amid her violent religious purges, Mary turned her attention to her half-sister Elizabeth, once the very person she'd cheered on to a throne. Now, Elizabeth endured the same psychological warfare Mary herself had suffered as a child under Henry VIII. Imprisonment, ceaseless interrogations, an ever-present spectre of fear. Elizabeth's confinement was a velvet prison. Every letter censored, every glance scrutinized, a hidden court perpetually passing judgment. Elizabeth, once free to roam palace halls, now languished in a Spartan chamber. Minimal furnishings, restricted books, a handful of confiscated jewels, serving as grim reminders of her fallen status. The sole loyal attendant smuggled in scraps of food and secret texts, while Mary's network of spies monitored every whispered word and subtle expression. The sister who once brought joy became a foe, and Elizabeth's days were consumed by tension and despair. As queen, Mary deftly manipulated both spiritual penance and cruel punishment to fortify her rule. The religious bonfires did more than snuff out Protestant fervour. They fanned the flames of terror throughout the court. The palace echoed with crackling embers, hurried prayers, and the soft clicks of imprisoned Elizabeth's chamber lock. Beyond the windows, the royal gardens lay draped in morning mist, their once vibrant blooms wilted, mirroring the kingdom's heavy heart. This sepulchral landscape highlighted the stark divide between Mary's regal outward show and the profound fissures within her soul. Each step she took through the corridors resonated like a funeral march, marking each sorrowful triumph and isolating her from any semblance of comfort. Upon Mary Tudor's death in November 1558, 25-year-old Elizabeth unexpectedly ascended the throne. She inherited a shattered realm, wounded by religious massacre and riven by divisions. Scarred by her mother's ignominy and her father's lesson that kinship was mere political currency, Elizabeth took the crown haunted by memory. Instead of hunting those who executed her mother or punishing Mary's loyalists, she chose conciliation, a policy of mercy to heal the kingdom's wounds. Yet from the outset, questions of marriage and an heir became an ever-present psychological minefield. Every foreign envoy who arrived to propose marriage found Elizabeth's subtle diplomacy, a graceful embrace of their culture, eloquent praise of their lands, but never a single word of acceptance. She leveraged this limbo as a bargaining chip for England's benefit, negotiating trade, defence alliances, and financial aid. But the waiting also bound her like wearing a heavy yoke for 45 years. Refusal was not only political strategy, but self-preservation. Marriage meant sharing power, risk of becoming a disposable pawn like her mother and Henry VIII's prior wives. When Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, her closest heir, was suspected of plotting Elizabeth's assassination, Elizabeth confined her for nearly 2 decades, rather than execute her outright. Mary lived, yet under virtual house arrest, deprived of foreign correspondence, limited in readings, cut off from true freedom. Finally, in 1587, Elizabeth ordered Mary's beheading, an act that echoed her own victimization within a violent system. Knowing she too had been targeted, Elizabeth nonetheless made a cold calculation to preserve her authority. Elizabeth's diplomacy bore the mark of distrust. She built an intricate intelligence network, planting spies within embassies and noble households. She understood no one could be trusted completely, a lesson imprinted by childhood betrayals. Her father's demands, her stepmother's harsh lessons, her sister's downfall. This ingrained suspicion ensured she never relinquished control. Her reign began with grand, ceremonial pageantry, solemn oaths, resounding church bells, and fireworks over London's skyline. Yet her heart remained unsettled. Nightly, she lay awake, mind racing over past traumas. Siblings she'd been forced to view as threats, the bloody cost of power. She never lingered in bed. The alarm clock was her constant companion, her court attire poised at hand, should rebellion or coup strike without warning. Under Elizabeth's rule, England flourished culturally and economically, but it also became a realm of watchful caution. New statutes cemented the Church of England. London's ports thrived on trade, yet censorship fences circled literature and theatre, lest dissent spark anew. She believed freedom required limits necessary to safeguard her reign. Elizabeth governed with icy poise. Personal emotions never tainted her statecraft. When the Spanish ambassador presented a matrimonial proposal, she quietly gazed out toward Westminster's bell towers, bathed in waning sunlight. She offered modest financial concessions, but never broached the subject of marriage. In her eyes glimmered resolve. Tudor's palace was now her kingdom, yet her heart remained a battleground between the yearning for kinship and the instincts of survival. Elizabeth was acutely aware of the lesson taught by Henry and Mary regarding heirs. Heirs are threats. She understood that any steps forward on the throne, even the small footprint of one's own child, could become a peril to the monarchy. Therefore, upon her accession, Elizabeth determined never to name a successor. The throne of the realm would belong to only one person, herself. This no succession policy was maintained for 45 years, becoming a strategy of instability that served as a deterrent. European powers, from Spain to France, had to remain cautious because no one knew who would inherit the crown. The domestic nobility also dared not plot, uncertain who might rise next and compelled to show absolute loyalty. There was only one person to whom Elizabeth ever opened her heart: Robert Dudley, the Earl of Essex, her childhood companion. Their close relationship spanned nearly 4 decades, filled with understanding glances and late-night discussions by candlelight. Yet Elizabeth never married him, knowing that a union would concede part of her authority to another and risk losing control. When Dudley, in anger and ambition, committed treason in the year 1601, Elizabeth again faced the choice that haunted her forebears: to show mercy or to execute a trusted confidant. She chose the rigours of political justice and ordered Dudley's execution. This harsh decision tormented her for the rest of her life, marking the chasm between personal affection and the demands of power. In her final years, Elizabeth gradually slipped into solitude and declining health. She suffered chronic insomnia, the double bed in the palace growing vast and cold. Often she skipped meals, sipping only an afternoon tea in place of dinner, as her stomach could not endure the stress and political torments. During long silent nights, she sat alone in the quiet room, candlelight flickering against the window pane, tears silently tracing her cheeks as she reflected on the sacrifices of power. No trusted courtier was allowed into that private space. She would not let anyone witness the fractures within her golden crown. In March of 1603, Elizabeth passed away in isolation. No family member stood by her side, only clerics chanting prayers for the great queen. She left behind a stable realm and a mighty empire, and at the same time, the greatest personal tragedy: a life wholly devoted to the nation, with a heart never finding solace in trust or love. Her passing closed a glorious era, leaving echoes of authority entwined with deep sorrow, as a reminder that within the shadows of the throne, one is most alone when unable to share the burden with another. Beyond the 3 legitimate children, Henry VIII once acknowledged Henry Fitzroy, his son with Elizabeth Blount, granting him the title of Duke and raising him in the palace like a prince. At first, Fitzroy was a source of royal pride, a dashing, robust boy with dark hair and a face sculpted like a Renaissance masterpiece. In the grand halls of Hampton Court, he ran alongside legitimate princes, clad in silk garments embroidered with golden dragons, studying Latin grammar and Roman history under the guidance of learned tutors. Yet as Henry's obsession with securing a lawful male heir deepened, Fitzroy became a politically sensitive issue. To quell doubts about the status of this princely bastard, Fitzroy was relocated to a secluded coastal island where the roar of the sea replaced the gentle hum of ceiling fans in the palace. His modest residence was vigilantly guarded, the walls painted in deep crimson so that sunlight barely filtered through narrow windows. There were no more lavish feasts, only the solitude of the ocean and the occasional visit from court dignitaries. When Fitzroy reached the age of 17, he fell gravely ill. Rumours of his demise spread swiftly. Some claimed tuberculosis, others whispered of poisoning. His brief life closed in tragic contrast, from the splendour of courtly life to delirium and then the stillness of a bed made of simple wood. Henry VIII, who once proclaimed, "My golden son," now stood silently at the bedside, emotions masked by the facade of royal composure, because even the sorrow of a lost son had to wear a mantle of unyielding authority. Several other illegitimate children of Henry with various court beauties were never officially recognised. They were sent to noble households, where refined hosts and devoted tutors provided education and the rituals of high society. Yet, bearing the brand of an unofficial royal, they lived in murky ambiguity, beneficiaries of the king's favour, yet forever haunted by the stigma of a prince without legitimacy. On quiet afternoons in their manor houses, they sat amidst oak-panelled rooms, gazing at intricately woven tapestries without daring to touch. Their meals were served on long tables draped in pristine white cloths, but they were seated at the far end where candlelight dimly reminded them of their precarious standing. They knew the world might speak of them as forgotten offspring, despite the titles or wealth bestowed upon them. This silent pressure etched wounds in their psyches. Eager once to play music, paint, and recite poetry, each melody, painting, and verse now served as a cruel reminder. You are the king's child, yet you are not written in the chronicle. As they matured, many suffered anxiety disorders, depression, and eating disorders. Long-term relationships eluded them, for deep inside lay a persistent fear. Would a partner ever truly believe in their blurred identity? When Henry VIII passed away, these children remained shadows cast by the legacy of a power-hungry king. They learned to mask emotions, to remain silent amid court gossip, and to don a veneer of dignified respect. Yet in the stillness of the night, as the palace slumbered, their loneliness surged. They were silent witnesses to Henry's cruelty, carrying those invisible scars throughout their lives. In 1536, Henry VIII suffered a grievous horseback accident during a joust. He fell from his saddle and lay unconscious for over 2 hours, resulting in severe traumatic brain injury. Previously, he had endured chronic gout and excessive weight, but after the fall, his incessant pain only magnified his fury. Recent medical research even suggests that Henry may have had MacLeod syndrome, a genetic disorder affecting the nervous system, marked by neurological decline, paranoia, and personality changes. Immediately following the accident, Henry was no longer the composed monarch he once was. He grew irritable, violent, and prone to losing control. The executions of Thomas More and John Fisher, events that once stunned Europe, now stood as brutal affirmations of his unyielding authority. Anne Boleyn, the ambitious wife he once cherished, likewise met the scaffold, sharing the same ruthless fate he had imposed on those he deemed traitors. Yet the most tragic consequences were not confined to those who fell under the executioner's blade. His 3 legitimate children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, watched their father's wrath intensify. Mary, the eldest daughter, developed an unshakable Catholic fervour as her spiritual refuge. Whenever her father's temper flared, she sought solace in Mass and prayer, convinced that divine justice alone could grant her stability. Her faith became the lifeline that kept her from being consumed by the court's tempest. Elizabeth, the second daughter, forged an impenetrable, emotional armour. She practiced neutrality before news of executions, so that courtiers could never discern her true feelings. She learned to mask sorrow behind a polite smile, projecting a chill distance that shielded her from her father's threats, but also left her isolated from genuine affection. Edward, the only son, was compelled to intellectualize every emotion. Witnessing palace horrors, he reduced them to lessons in politics and religion, never shedding a tear or betraying fear. He signed punitive decrees before his 10th birthday, as though completing a school exercise. This emotional detachment let Edward navigate royal pressures without faltering, yet it robbed him of deep empathy. Post-accident, the Tudor court became a labyrinth of tension. Sumptuous wine banquets lost their laughter, replaced by hushed whispers and wary gazes. Heavy wooden doors slammed shut to mute the cries and tears echoing through the corridors. Flickering candlelight revealed ancestral portraits whose stern faces challenged anyone daring to expose the pain hidden beneath regal veneers. Every meeting with the king became a high-stakes gamble. Mary brought her prayers, Elizabeth her serene composure, and Edward his political memoranda. They bore not only the king's political demands but the psychological torment wrought by a father increasingly unhinged by his injury. Long nights saw Mary awake in vigil, Elizabeth practicing her stoic mask, and Edward poring over decrees by candlelight, rehearsing his signature. Henry's transformation sent ripples of unease through courtiers and nobles. No one dared publicly discuss the king's health, fearing that even a whisper might be deemed treasonous. Political discourse turned cold. Words were as carefully handled as fragile glass, never freely released. The psychological wounds Henry inflicted would never truly heal. Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward each carried their share of that dark inheritance. They matured with the bitter lesson that power is not only a throne or a sword, but also fear and control. And when Henry VIII finally passed, the sole legacy he left was not victory or a flourishing realm, but 3 fractured souls lingering in the shadows of the Tudor court. Henry VIII's cruelty did not occur in isolation. It was sustained by the entire Tudor court system where power and religion intertwined to justify violence. Thomas Cromwell, the king's right hand, orchestrated the campaign of intimidation against Princess Mary. He drafted orders, dispatched agents to monitor her every move, from letters to her mother to a single glance. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, used theological doctrine to claim that forcing Mary to acknowledge her father's spiritual authority was a pathway to saving her soul, a chilling justification for psychological torture. The servants, tutors, and courtiers who witnessed Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward's suffering daily became informants, reporting every word, every gesture of the children. They noted Elizabeth's eavesdropping on private meetings, Mary's secret smiles while reading prayers, and Edward's grimace upon hearing execution news. These fragments were compiled into dossiers, analysed and reported to the throne, allowing the king to continue his campaign of control. When Henry severed ties with Rome, the English bishops became instruments for legitimizing violence. They drafted canons and issued decrees stating that only royal authority could protect the faith, and branding any resistance as treason and defiance of God. Foreign diplomats, horrified by the executions and Mary's tears and Elizabeth's isolation, were powerless. Though they pleaded to intervene, they were rebuffed with the refrain, "This is an internal matter." The public and nobility, though, buzzing in taverns and at banquets, dared not speak out. Any criticism was deemed treasonous. Those who occasionally voiced dissent were summoned before the court, losing lands or forced into exile. Under Tudor rule, public spaces became walls of enforced silence, where even a whisper of dissent was unacceptable. Within this darkness, the tragedy of Henry's own family shone painfully bright. His legitimate children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, were his first victims. They survived only by honing survival skills imposed on them in childhood. In return, they lost their capacity to trust. Mary could not trust those around her. Elizabeth dared not reveal her true feelings. Edward lost the ability to experience genuine family bonds. Henry's acknowledged illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, born to Elizabeth Blount, was granted the title of Duke and educated as a prince. Yet as Henry's desire for a legitimate son grew more desperate, Fitzroy was banished to a remote island, fading from court sight like a ghost. Other unacknowledged children, born to various courtiers and chambermaids, were sent to noble households educated and cared for, yet burdened by the stigma of being at once favoured and denied. They grew up straddling 2 worlds, royal privilege and anonymous doubt. All of them had to piece together their identities from the ashes of a dynasty founded on lies. The Tudor court did not merely normalise violence, it enshrined fear as law. Mary's silent tears became testament to authority. Elizabeth's isolation became a diplomatic asset. Edward's emotional detachment became a political weapon. The tragedy of Henry VIII and the Tudor court stands as a profound warning. It shows that psychological abuse, when systematised, not only destroys its immediate victims, but sows seeds of mistrust and brokenness across generations. The Tudor line, once mighty, ended with Henry's children each bearing both the resilience to survive and the wounds that would never fully heal. And that concludes tonight's journey through the darkness and the emotional scars of the Tudor family under the reign of Henry VIII. For over 1 hour, we ventured into the world of 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, who were once the center of Europe's most powerful court, yet who became victims of the very dynasty that bore them. What will you take away from today's video? An understanding of psychological abuse. More than a historical tale, this video illustrated how power can twist maternal and paternal love into tools of control, robbing children of safety and the freedom to be themselves. Recognizing signs of emotional trauma, from chronic headaches and overwhelming anxiety to sleep disorders, we saw how psychological wounds manifest physically. These are scars that some of us or people close to us may carry, even if they did not grow up in a gilded palace. Lessons in resilience. Mary exemplified both collapse and inner strength as she resisted pressure. Elizabeth turned fear into diplomatic strategy. Edward, though young, learned to make hard decisions. Each, in their own way, affirmed the human instinct to survive. Core messages and values. Power must be paired with responsibility and unconditional love. Unlimited power breeds injustice and violence. True love, by contrast, asks for nothing in return and imposes no conditions. The strength of empathy and emotional support. Had Mary, Elizabeth, or Edward had even one person who truly understood them, their wounds might not have cut so deep. In modern life, we can be that support by listening, sharing, and withholding judgment. Mental health care matters. The Tudor story shows that emotional wounds can leave lasting impact on feelings, behavior, and relationships. Seeking professional help, talking with friends, or simply practicing mindfulness, journaling, or nature walks are all ways to begin healing. Practical takeaways for modern life. Identify and reject emotional abuse. We need not be kings or queens to face conditional relationships at home, work, or among friends. Have the courage to recognize and protect yourself and your loved ones. Cultivate resilience. Rather than avoiding hardship, see it as a chance to grow. Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward teach us that no matter how brutal our circumstances, we can find the inner strength to endure. Cherish trust and unconditional love. Value those who stand by you in hardship. That is the key to overcoming wounds and building a happier life. Thank you for spending this time exploring a haunting chapter of history that also offers profound lessons. I hope that after watching, each of us recognizes the power of the human spirit and the courage to face past darkness, so we can build a brighter future together. Finally, if you're still awake, good night and sweet dreams. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our newest and best videos. Sleep well